This episode is brought to you by Lexham Press, who publishes books that love the Word, love the faith, and love the Church. Lexham Press was recently acquired by Baker Publishing Group. Our July book of the month is Meeting God in His Means of Grace, How Word, Sacrament, and Prayer Help Us Encounter Christ. You can receive a 30% discount on this title and all previous books of the month by visiting bakerbookhouse.com/pages/Mere Fidelity. You can find that link in our show notes to get 30% off our book of the month from Lexham Press.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Mere Fidelity, a podcast by Mere Orthodoxy, where we think about the Word of God and the world we live in. My name is Derek Rishmawy, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined by regular cast and crew members Alistair Roberts, James Wood, and Joe Minnick. Good to see you, fellas. Today we wanted to talk not just as fellas, but about the fellas. Wanted to take up the issue of how to talk about masculinity. You know, this conversation is in the air right now for several years now. I'm not going to rehearse all the data and all the conversations that are going on, but people are finally wondering what to do, what we have to do, what must be done, what must be said to help men, to encourage men to be men in good ways, right? There's been a conversation about how young men are falling behind on all these metrics when it comes to college graduation and mental health and suicidality and finances and getting married and staying married and all those sorts of things. And then there's just the frontline experience of so many who have young men in their lives that they love and they care for, and they look at them, and maybe the young men in their lives are doing well, but their friends are struggling. And so one of the things that they're struggling with is just this very question of what does it mean to be a man? How can you be a man? Is that something you should strive for? Is it something that just naturally comes to you? And so this crisis of masculinity. So we want to talk about that a little bit, how to talk about men. We thought we'd lead in by having James sort of essay his own answers. I think you spoke on this recently at a Plow event, right, James?
Correct. Yes.
How are we supposed to talk about masculinity, James? How should we talk about being a man?
Well, I was asked to speak on this topic, which I found interesting because it's not necessarily a topic that I consider myself any sort of expert in. And I think they asked me partly because of that. I think they saw me as someone who definitely cares about the struggles of young men today and is probably, within more traditional convictions about manhood, but probably occupies a complicated space largely because of the essay that I wrote for them, where I kind of narrated my own struggles with my upbringing and my relationship with my father, but then had some male mentors in my life that were really significant. But then also I said I was, so I'm a funny figure also because I have 5 girls, 5 daughters, no men in my house. However, I would like them to have good men to marry eventually.
Yeah.
Well, I care about the plight of young men, and I teach college students. I think all of us are connected to young men in our lives, and so we I think we all observe, at varying capacities, what young men are facing today, which are, in some ways is not that different than what men have faced throughout history, but also in some ways has unique struggles and trials. But anyway, so I started by saying, I'll just say a few things about what I shared in my address and we'll kind of see where it goes. But first of all, I do think it's good that we're talking about this as a culture. More and more people are talking about it. We even launched a conversation a few weeks ago from that Johann Kurtz essay on X that kind of addresses these from various angles. So I think it's good. I think a lot of people are waking up to this. There was the viral essays in Compact over the last year. Also, just interesting fact that I like to bring up about this is there were people who were, ahead of the curve on this. I think like Jordan Peterson, for instance. I'm not a huge Jordan Peterson fan. I always say that when I bring up his name, but I do think he was an interesting figure that really cared about this issue, probably years ahead of even many evangelicals caring about it. I often think Jordan is a very interesting figure in this space because I think if you don't pay attention to him, he often gets lumped in with figures like Andrew Tate or whatever or manosphere figures.
Which is crazy.
And that's just so funny because Jordan is not like that at all. Even if you don't like him, I think he actually is trying to pull guys back from the darkness of that space. And it was brought up in the conference, like, the idea of stoicism. Does being a man mean you have to be stoic? And I think it's interesting. Jordan's also interesting on that front because in many ways he does advance pretty stoic ideas, which is one of the reasons why I don't think his arguments are often that interesting. But he himself is like one of the men in the man space who's most willing to cry at the drop of a hat.
Yeah.
He probably cries publicly more than any man I've ever seen. Anyway, so I do think though, so I think it's good we're talking about it. Not only the struggles of young men, which is one issue, but also what does it mean to be a man? I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, a few years ago, we had a pretty big landmark movie came out, What is a Woman? Well, could we imagine a movie that would care about what is a man? But I think it's difficult to talk. I think these topics are more difficult even for Christians to talk about because I think the Bible says something, but not as much as we wish it would say. And maybe Alistair's got a lot of thoughts on this. He's thought about this a lot more than I have. But when you actually go to the Bible to try to define what is a man, and if you try to define it in the abstract, apart from various roles that men might inhabit as husband, father, son, etc., it's actually not abundantly clear. And I think that's part of what makes this conversation difficult. The last thing I'll say is I also think now the men, especially in Christian spaces, that often have stepped into the fray here and are really excited to talk about this topic and obsessed about it. I often think that they, again, overread the biblical data and are reading in certain stereotypes themselves. I'm glad that they step into it, but I don't find the people that are most excited about talking about masculinity I don't find them often the most helpful. Now, I will say the book that I looked at in preparation for my talk that I did enjoy was Seth Trout's book. I thought, and I could explain later why I find that helpful. Well, I guess maybe that's the last thing I'll say. I like that Seth starts with what are the opposites, and so he kind of starts with a via negativa, of a sort. Like he starts. So what is man not? Man is not God, so therefore he's a creature. He needs to be humble. Man is not an animal, so he doesn't live by the beastly appetites, but he actually lives according to reason and discipline. And then man is not a boy, and that's what I focused my talk on. Is that contrast? So he needs to be mature and care for others, but then the last one is man is not a woman. But I think too many of the conversations start with that one, and I actually like that Seth kind of reserves that one for last. So anyway, those are some just initial thoughts about this conversation.
I'll turn it over to Alistair and Joe in a minute. I will say I also highly commend Seth's book. I blurbed that one, and it's an excellent option for taking young college men through. Yeah, oftentimes the guys who are most excited online about that stuff, it goes in weird directions. It is interesting as growing up evangelical and then reformed and then all that kind of thing. This thing comes in waves, right? It's having men's ministries and masculinity discourse and what does it mean to be a biblical man and all those sorts of things. Women have been talking about, how common biblical, womanhood discussions has been, but it's been extremely common for biblical manhood to be in the bloodstream of our conversations for a long time. It just kind of ebbs and flows from, hey, we're focused on this. Hey, this is awkward. Hey, let's not talk about it. Hey, gosh, we stopped talking about it for a while. We should talk about it more again. And so these life cycles, these ebbs and flows come and go. But I think the focus on it again is salutary. The need is there. But I do think getting to a good normative account is really important. Alistair?
A challenge in the conversation, I think, is that so much of it is taking place online, and the internet is a place where we're representations. It's not grounded in real activity. It's a realm of representations. And so much of what's taking place is the production of images, a focus upon creating a certain image or performance of masculinity
A vibe.
that makes it very difficult to actually have a healthy masculinity that is grounded and about something. If we want to have a healthy masculinity, one of the challenges is we can't pursue it directly. We pursue the world and engagement in actual relationships and commitments and duties, and masculinity arises out of that. You need to have the soil for it. Whereas if you don't have that soil of concrete relationships, of concrete contexts, of specific duties that fall upon your shoulders, then you're going to get a very distorted form of masculinity. So a lot of the character of online masculinity is a sort of drag for men. There's a sense in which the sort of performativity that's described within the work of such as Judith Butler applies to just identity online more generally. And that's even for people whose identity aligns with their biological sex. Besides that, I think there's a focus in the fragilized sense of identity that we have online and more generally within the contemporary world. There's a tendency to focus very much upon definitions and certain specific roles that are well defined that are given to men or to women that help to distinguish them. But most of the things that pertain to being a man or a woman is not some universal definition that applies to each and every man. It's something that is seen in a specific form or iteration of faithful masculinity or femininity. It's something that can't be captured in a single definition, that exceeds it. And the more that we focus upon definitions, the more that we focus upon rules, etc., the more we end up actually diminishing the reality that masculinity or femininity represent. And so I think, first of all, it's not something that we can pursue directly. It's not to be found in representation primarily. And also, the more that we focus upon definitions, the more that we'll end up with a diminished sense. And also, the fragilization of identity will increase because we'll have to differentiate ourselves in ways that just feel forced and arbitrary and artificial.
So that all sounds right in the abstract. But part of me is just wondering about the concrete, though. I mean, you're wanting to push us to the concrete, but you start to think about the concrete. I think about the conversations I've had with some young men over the last couple of years, and guys need concrete direction. Young men need concrete direction, and a lot of it has come out from me just asking them, like, "Hey, what makes your dad your dad? What does he do? What is he like? What did he teach you about? What's the portrait that you have absorbed from him about what it means to be a man when you grow up?" Right. So the boy to man is a real thing, right? A boy does this, but a man, once he grows up, once he matures, does that. There are some concrete scripts that have to be given to some degree. Without any script, even the variations, it's kind of like you got to learn the rules of poetry before you start breaking them to make meaning, so to speak. And so I do think at some point you have to give young men concrete scripts. And this is where I'm curious. I'm curious how you guys think about the very common framework of, three P's. Provide, protect, procreate. These are kind of just three generic scripts that have been handed on across time, culture, space. Everybody has rituals around them, and kind of rites of passage where, okay, now you got to start providing for yourself.
Well, that's a big loss though today, right? I mean, right there. I mean, so a great episode that just addressed this was Ross Douthat's last conversation with Scott Galloway. And so he's like a guy center left who's trying to address these, I would call him a reality respecter of a sort, trying to address these conversations from a kind of a different vantage point, but he ends up on the three Ps. And I love how Ross was trying to push him towards like traditional family. He just wasn't able to get there. But the scripts thing and the rights, I think the scripts and the rights, those are two big conversation points that I think are very relevant. And that's actually what I did in the rest of my talk was I provided images from various movies. And my joke in the talk was I was going to, it was at the Plow conference. It was mostly Bruderhof people. And when they told me to speak on this, like, hey, but don't make it too nerdy and academic. And so the way that I do that, and you guys might appreciate this, you're instructors for young people, is I'm like, well, I'll talk about movies then. I had a little minor freak out on the drive out to the Bruderhof because I realized, wait, do these people watch movies? So they assured me that some of them do. But I think those images were helpful. They're not all perfect, but I think we need to give young men, even though this can fall. The danger is, does this fall into a stereotype that actually isn't the full picture? I think was what Alistair's getting at. And is this typecasting masculinity in a certain respect? But I think what you're getting at, Derek, before I get to the rights point, is it's very similar to what Alistair was saying, is that it gets at the vernacular aspect of gender. Every context, every culture is going to have, it's going to be inflected differently, what it means to be a man. But I think what we feel like we're losing in our culture is that not only is there a variety that's specific to our time, it's like we're not even willing to admit that there's something concrete here in our culture that we're trying to advance, promote, encourage young men, guide them in. And so then young men are just like stuck and they're lost. And so I think we don't have the scripts often. But then the rights point is either, do we have rites of passage? I mean, that's a big problem. So you say, I know what it means to become a man from a boy, but the predominant rite of passage into manhood in the popular culture is losing your virginity, which is like very tragic and actually juvenile, and actually not masculinity of the biblical vision. And so I think we don't even have those.
Yeah. So just tying a couple of these threads together, I think it's a really good question that people need something concrete. And maybe one way of getting at it is actually to do the via negativa, but make the via negativa concrete rather than abstract. Man is not a woman, man is not a this. That's very helpful. I haven't read that book. Sounds helpful, but you could also
it's very concrete. It's very helpful.
And for our sake, one way to just continue that metaphor is I think you could make some of the concrete actions through the via negativa as well, partially because to riff on stuff Alistair said before and what James just said, the context and the rights through which we feel those actions, those concrete actions, are kind of absent to us socially in the way that they have been there before. And one of the dangers, and I think this is one of the things that we need to point out to young men, which we'll get to that concrete larger point, is the degree to which so much of the male discourse functions within the same headspace in psychology as the very identity politics they tend to be otherwise be critical of. And it's the same thing going on with racial identity politics, gender identity politics. A lot of these things are people in America, for instance. The reason this comes from America is we're all just kind of generically white, and there's a very thin civic order at this point holding us together. And the same thing is true of African Americans in America. Tribal identities are mostly lost over hundreds of years, and you kind of have a thin generic identity. And and there's some grief to be had in that. It's not natural that humans have that thin of a corporate identity. There's a loss there. But what happens in the context of a grieving people very often is that we, through our anger, go seize the positive, some kind of LARPy positive vision of what we feel the loss of, rather than recognizing something's just not here, and we have to do the slow and hard work of recreation. And one of the things I think we can say, and so here's the via negativa in the concrete, is real men do not move through the world by resentment. One thing we can say is it's not this re-seizing the old ways out of a resentment of the way the world is. Real manhood arises to the occasion of the circumstance you've been thrown in. You're right. It's the Lord of the Rings. I don't want to be born right now either. I wish I was born during nicer times as well. But you know what real men do? They stand up and it is their delight in a way. It is their easy yoke to bear the burden of that slow endurance and that movement. And even, last thing I'll say, and even to get people to recognize it as a peaceable vocation that they have, a vocation in which, and I think this gets to the depths of it for me, training young men to look out at the world and say all the way down in their heart, it is good that things exist, and it's good that I exist, and it's good that these people exist. Tapping into the depths of that, I think, is the animation of masculine movement. It's not moving out of this resentment, even though it is taking up the battles.
One aspect of my concern about the emphasis upon scripts is maybe taking something like The Lord of the Rings as an example. There are just so many different types of men and many good ways to be a man. The characters that we see in The Lord of the Rings present a myriad different versions of masculinity and virtues of masculinity, and there's not just one kind. And the danger, it seems to me, is having lost the patterns. And I don't think what people had primarily in the past was scripts. What they had were patterns and models and contexts within which masculinity would naturally thrive. And what we're looking for now is something a bit more artificial. We're looking for definitions, we're looking for scripts, and to apply those almost top down, whereas this is the sort of thing that is not typically learnt that way. It's something that you learn as you spend time with other men, as you have contexts within which you are brought out into the world, into realms of responsibility, realms that stretch you, that enable you to grow, that give you dignity in who you are, give you a sense of your specific responsibilities and how you might rise to those. Now, that takes many different forms within a typical society that's healthy. And it seems to me that when we're looking for scripts, definitions, rules, etc., we're actually going about this in a way that most societies that have had healthy masculinity have not. Most of them have had far more organic ways of approaching this and less rationalistic ways, perhaps.
Sure. And that's all true. And I love the caveats that are necessary for good pastoral practice and not pigeonholing folks. I guess here's the thing. We do live in our society, though. We live in a weird, like in the
it's not
technical
happening
sense,
organically and healthily. No,
it's just not. It's not. You know, there's a sense in which, again, you know, you come back to a theme that we come back to on this show a lot is oftentimes you're recreating that within the organism of the church, where the natural is being reborn, rebirthed, restitched, resituated, and kind of an organic way of life where, a young man can walk into a church and find 15 different kinds of good men right there. And it's almost, and this is where I don't talk about sports a lot. But this is one of the values of team sports as just a general formative reality is, young men find themselves oftentimes and understand their place and their way of being a man in contexts and relationships with other men. And oftentimes in a team, one of the great things is you get to understand, like, hey, that guy's really good as pick your football, right? There's quarterbacks, there's linemen, there's wide receivers. There's all these different kinds of guys who, like, that guy runs real fast, that guy can catch, that guy can lay a hit. But everybody has to be able to lay a hit somehow. Everybody has to be able to take a hit. Everybody has to be able to coordinate themselves in the way that they are with the other men on the team in order to advance the ball down the field or switch it out. Some guys are strikers, some guys are defenders, some guys whatever, but everybody has to be able to shoot and defend, pass and all those sorts of things. But within teams, you can start to recognize, hey, that guy's not the biggest guy on the field, but that doesn't make him less of a guy. He's fast. He's quick. He's all these sorts of things. We're like, hey, he's not the strongest man, but he's agile. You gain categories for different types of good men who know how to play well with others and know how to work towards that common end, that common goal, and that sort of thing. And within the church, you have that. I think oftentimes you have the guys who are good deacons and elders and all that. But the thing is, they have a goal. They have a very specific goal that they're all attending to. And there is something concrete about, like, in soccer, you have to get the ball into the other goal and you have to keep the ball out of our goal. And that is like a definitional thing. That is a script. There are generic ground rules that enable us to play the game in our specific ways that are still nevertheless proper ways of playing soccer, whatever it is. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at when it comes to talking about young men. There's going to be a lot of ways that the young men I'm talking to are going to be good, that can be good at being young men. But, we still have to aim them at a goal. And there are still like general, broad 2 or 3 script level, rule level things that you have to give people concretely that they then work out the particularities of the way they pursue. And that I still think we can't avoid that. There still has to be something at that level where it's like, hey guys, there's a million different good ways of being men. And you just got to, I don't think anybody's saying this, but in the absence of those things, we have to give them something, is what I'm saying.
Just to sympathize with your point, I think one of the tensions that we're highlighting here is the tension that, as Alistair was pointing out, one of the reasons I think Alistair is saying these wouldn't have been scripts before is because life and the patterns of life would have just nudged a person through the habits of a community naturally toward some role of provision, protection, and procreation. The amount of pairings off, whether you were a weak-willed person or a strong-willed person, the whole, profile of personalities tended through the social nudges, as it were, to wind paired off. When that's not true anymore, though, it still is the case that we're driven by natural law to those 3 Ps. Procreation and the role of men to provide and protect. Those are orienting things. And I think one of the questions is, in what way are they orienting? In one sense, I think we can say they're again orienting almost in a via negativa way, in the sense that a society that recognizes we are not providing the nudges by which 80% of young people pair off male and female. That's a problem. That's just straight up a problem. A society that just sees that's what's happening with young people needs to say we are sick and there's a disease in the body in some way because these 3 Ps aren't just that doesn't mean you're not a man if you don't do those 3 Ps, but in an Aristotelian sense of a sort of are there always or for the most part, it's generally the case that the average person should be pairing off in this way and kind of take on this sort of role. Again, there's plenty of exceptions, but it's right. On the other hand, that's different than saying, okay, you, the individual man, your only goal in life is those 3 Ps, and then those can animate. And maybe those should drive you in a certain sort of way. Yeah. But there's different levels, I think, at which we find orientation, and different levels at which we identify the problem and the fix there. And it is one of the saddest things. We've all met. And I think it's just worth saying out loud. We've all met young men who are frustrated. Maybe we all know, not that I'm not an awkward guy, but maybe we know a couple of awkward dudes who you look at and you're like, all right, 200 years ago, the guy with this personality and this set of gifts and competencies probably would have paired off in his community. And he just knows that. He knows that he was born into a time, and it's hard for him not to be resentful. And this is where the manosphere is going to play into something. But that guy, and there's something sad. There is something to be grieved there. And so I think there is something, this is really to get to Derek's point. Those things really still are concrete. Maybe one of the questions is left is how do they become concretely orienting for the individual?
Mere Orthodoxy is excited to announce that the Daily Liturgy podcast has joined our podcast network. The podcast is produced by our friends at Coram Deo Church in Omaha, Nebraska, and features prayers from the riches of the church, new written prayers, and daily scripture readings. We are integrating the Daily Liturgy throughout Mere Orthodoxy. You can receive the Daily Liturgy every morning on the Daily Liturgy podcast in written form through the Daily Liturgy newsletter and on our website. We've made it possible to use your preferred Bible translation and even switch to a Bible in 2 years plan on the web version while still integrating with the Daily Liturgy. We want to see every Christian grow in their devotion to Christ in Scripture and in prayer. We believe this daily resource can serve as an aid for individuals, families, and even entire churches who adopt it. You can start listening and reading by going to our website, mereorthodoxy.com, or clicking the link in the show notes.
I think it's related to the idea of script, or just that general theme. An analog to me here is like the meta-modern conversation in film, right? And like how we've moved out of a modern period where the scripts are really tight and predictable, stereotyped, to into a postmodern period where we're deconstructing those. We're showing,
There's no scripts.
There were, the things weren't as neat as they made it out to be. And now it's like, but what do we do? And so I think when you live in an era of massive deconstruction of all the scripts, I think returning to something like that idea to some degree is helpful in orienting people. And I think it's like the concrete, for instance, like getting the 3 Ps are often in what you just mentioned, Joe, of the pairing off. I think we should probably help retrieve kind of some normal scripts for life pathways. Like most men probably should be thinking about moving towards marriage. There are obviously people called to celibacy, but we can't completely over-orient to that issue to not help people. And also the dating culture is very fraught in our moment. So how do we just help young people have some pathways even towards like dating in a healthy way? Again, not being overly dogmatic or stereotyped or overly pressuring. If you don't do this, then you're less human. All of the caveats.
Yeah.
But just giving them something. And that's one of the things I try to help my young, and I actually ended my talk with some of that. I was like, hey, guys, like, you need to ask your part. I know this might sound too stereotypical, but like, it's your job to take initiative and ask the girl out. Like, okay, there might be a variation to that. There might be exceptions, but just like be brave, my dudes, and things like, and just like little concrete things like that. I've taught my students these things and they just like gasp like of relief. Like they just want someone to help them. And I think that's
yeah.
So, I mean, just to reiterate, and I want to get to Alistair in a minute. In past, like just to stereotype again, in traditional cultures, the scripts could be stultifying, and the stereotyping could actually not make space for folks who actually, by the Lord's appointment, they don't fit well with that, but they actually have good God glorifying ways of being in the world. And modernity and liberalism creates space for the unique individual and all that sort of thing. But on the other side of hypermodernity, hyper neoliberalism, whatever you want to say, it's too liquid. We're all drowning in the demand to be that specific individual, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, yeah, but like 85 to 90% of you actually just accept being a normie and like stick to the script without being a jerk if somebody is walking down a slightly different path or whatever it is. And I'll even say that even those scripts, like within the church, there's all these different mentions of everybody knows the guy who's unmarried and has no kids, but he's a wonderful spiritual father. And the same thing with a woman in our church who's like wonderfully motherly towards the younger folks in her orbit. She still inhabits that role in different ways and in spiritual ways that, like, yeah, she's working a job, she's doing this, but like, so there's even ways where the scripts, as long as we are making space for the providential particularities of the way the Lord is writing that person's story, there's still ways that they offer guidance and shape. But Alistair, you wanted to push back or caveat or remind us of some biblical themes?
I think the idea of scripts is just misguided. I just don't think that's
what's a better term for this kind of thing? Like what's a better way of framing the normative, the average and the normative?
The problem is that so much of the modern world is shaped by a certain, first of all, representation and performance. And that whole concept of a script is in many senses playing into that model. And also the idea of you as an individual and expressivism, all these sorts of things are bound up in unhelpful ways in the concept of script. Traditional societies, the point I was making is not primarily that there are 1,000 different versions of masculinity be expressed. No, my point is that within most traditional societies, there are a variety of different types of men. They are not performing masculinity in the same way as we do. They are men. There's not a sense in which they have to perform masculinity in the way that we feel that.
Sure.
To create a representation of masculinity, to become something that they are not in fact. There's certainly rites of passage that must occur, but they are shepherded through rites of passages. They have patterns, they have models, they have ways in which the society the society is not just giving them an individual script that they must follow. The whole society is ordered towards marriage. The whole society is ordered to pair people off. And so I think a lot of the concept of a script has unhelpful modern assumptions about how our societies operate bound up within it. And I'd like us to kind of step back from that and recognize the ways in which the sorts of emphasis upon performance, expression, role, all of these things that are very important for us. Now, we may have to work with those because that's the context that we're in. But it's also important to recognize that that is, in many respects, a dysfunction, and we'll not arrive at functionality simply by reacting against the dysfunction. We need to understand how these...
But that's not what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I think what Derek is saying is, okay, so we have to deal with the society we're in, which you're kind of saying, but we don't live in those societies where those nudges that Joe is talking about are so obvious.
But we also need...
So you might have to make what was previously implicit a little bit more explicit, I think is what the conversation is about.
But you also need to think about how do you move beyond scripts? Because the script...
I think it just depends on how we're defining
But here's the thing. Here's the thing. We're all 40 plus. We're all 40 plus. I'm thinking about 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds who, I'm going to back off a minute here. There's this level at which some of this stuff I didn't really wrestle with as explicitly. I didn't identify with the whole masculinity conversation, whatever it is, in my early 20s when all the young reform guys were into all the kind of discussion there. I was like, whatever, it's just, just be a man, marry your girl. My parent, I had a family where a lot of things were organically just modeled and that kind of thing. The self-consciousness of these things came to me working with the 18 to 24-year-olds that I work with right now, who are even further down the timeline of liquid disembodiment, and having my kids, which forced on me a consciousness of things at a visceral level, maybe that was already natural for certain other guys, but the impulse to up my life insurance coverage it was almost biological when I saw my kid. So some of these things we're already past, we've already embodied, we've grown up with, but I'm looking at these kids who, when you're dealing with a youngster who doesn't have the rules, like they weren't given the rules, they weren't given the embodied rules, they weren't given the embodied organic, whatever, and they just don't have it. You have to give them something. Like, that's what I'm saying. Like,
well, you definitely have to give them something, but.
So I'm saying, what do you think we should give them besides scripts? What's your term? Because you got to use something.
Contexts and models. So you talked, for instance, about we were discussing earlier, the team and sports. It's one of the things that a lot of young men lack are male contexts and context of mentorship and formation like you'd have with a coach. That's a very different thing from a script. And when we're thinking about what many men lack, it's not so much a script sometimes as just the context that would make many of these things plausible, or many of the ways in which they could be formed. One of the struggles of being a man today is that you spend much of your time in mixed or female-dominated contexts, and that's not a healthy situation for men. That's not the primary context within which men will develop masculinity. And so there is an importance of relating to women and developing your masculinity in that context too. But if you have no male contexts and male intergenerational context particularly, you're going to struggle to find any sort of orientation. That you might get script. That is also something that often people will look for in male contexts online, which can often be fairly feral. But ideally what you need is a healthy real world context with intergenerational relationships, with healthy mentors and examples, with patterns that have been worked out in that community, and a group of fellow travelers who are moving through this, a cohort that are moving through it together. And that is a very different sort of thing from a script. It's giving you direction, it's giving you pointers, it's giving you models, but it's not a script. And I think
what I'm hearing is an in real life podcast, right? Like an embodied podcast. Sorry, dude. I couldn't resist.
Mere Fidelity 24/7. Yeah, I think one of the tensions I think here is that I suspect that a lot of precisely because we're living in an era without the nudges and disorientation, and yet still remain natures, still have the natures that we have to reinvigorate the action of those natures and to re-engage it, is going to, we acquire by conscious action. It requires of us a certain kind of conscious engagement, what have been given by background noise in one sense in the past. And the consequence of that is that most of what we're going to do to re-engage our nature is going to look a little LARPy and at its worst become cult. On the other hand, no good thing that we do in this area probably wouldn't look strange to somebody living in a context where all of this was nudging. It might look, maybe we're overusing the metaphor script, but might have looked scripted compared to how this would have been instantiated in their own context and past. And maybe one of the things here is I'm thinking of two different senses of script, and I hate to achieve ecumenicity through etymologies, but there's the sense of script as like a script for a narrative. Here are the steps that everybody should go take. But when I first heard the word script in this conversation, I was thinking more of like a prescription, which some people would call a script, like the script the doctor gives you. And in those senses, I think some of the traditional things are good orienting points for young men where it's like, what am I supposed to be doing with my life? And it's like, hey, maybe marriage, maybe going in marriage and having a family to care for, maybe that's a good thing for you. Maybe that actually would be. And I think, I suppose I come at some of this, thinking in terms of scripts, somewhat like Derek did, which was, when all this conversation was going on in the early 2000s, it kind of missed me. And I think that was probably because I was raised in a context where masculinity was talked about, not necessarily in my home, but in my larger world in a way where I was already kind of tired of the conversation. And so that discourse more or less went by, but it was interesting. It was engaging an email group that a lot of us were a part of, our famous email group in the past, where I came to realize in some sense I was some of the ways in which I felt like this was a normal way to be a man were not normal. I wound up having a lot of male friends and coming to realize, oh, this is just what normal guys are like. This is what it's like to engage a normal person. This is the level of edge they have. This is what it's like to be in a group of men and have a conversation. This is what you need to develop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what was weird is that was not native to me at all. And oddly, it wasn't, but I wasn't alienated from it, even though I, felt a little different on some days, you might say. But it was interesting because it was a context in which, on the other hand, I felt certain things engaged in me and flowered in me through engagement with other men, even though, I didn't leave that ever feeling like I was, particularly appealed to by a lot of things that appeal to others. And yet now I find myself I'll stop after this, but I find myself in a similar context, which Derek is, and this is a lot of us, you're teaching young men. And one of the reasons this has become a much more important discourse to me is not so much that I'm trying to figure out something for myself, but that I'm around all these young men who really do take these questions a lot more. It doesn't matter how much I feel about them. This is so live. The voices in their heads are loud.
Yes.
And you do have to, I can't sit around and be triggered by it. And you can't just sit and dismiss it and treat it like it's stupid, or you have a generation of young people that you can't get to. And it's like, yeah. And so I feel myself in those waters. And so wanting to have a sense, I feel the pain Derek is talking about, because they really do need this.
And the one thing, and James is going to talk, the one thing I'll say is, when you are an educator and a teacher, like many of us are, pastors, you are often the one setting the temperature for the culture of that group and the normative conditions in which that natural, organic give and take is, and formative power is being exercised. James?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something related to that. And Alistair kind of brought it up a minute ago with reference to your sports analogy. Because the thing I kept thinking about when you were sharing that is the one thing that you hadn't talked about is maybe one of the most important pieces was on sports teams, a very important figure is the coach.
Yeah.
And related to, I think, manhood and helping young men today is, and this is where I totally agree with Alistair, and this is what I shared in my talk also, is a major answer is not just scripts that we distribute online, but in flesh relationships of mentoring, intergenerational, and getting guys offline. Because I think one of the frustrations for me is how these conversations often happen are in contexts where there actually aren't in flesh mentor coaches, but rather in the context of just online brother wars, right? Bunch of brothers ganging up together. They're frustrated with the elder generation. They're kind of living in that grievance, resentment that Joe was talking about earlier. And this actually isn't helping them transition from boy to man. They're actually kind of like, what's his name? Cale Zeldin refers to as Peter Pan's Lost Boys. So much of the online space of the masculinity conversation is just keeping guys in that immaturity and calling it masculinity. And what I think the big answer is, but it's simple and therefore it's frustrating for how simple it is, I think often is pushing guys to get real in-person male mentors, and especially within the context of the church. And then lastly, I'll say one of the other things I shared in the talk was related to kind of like pathways you're trying to encourage and things like this for helping guys. And this is one of the things that I came to just in studying this topic as I was forced to present on it and like trying to go back to the scriptures to be my guide was I really think it's important to help guys retrieve also not only the glory of mentors, but the glory of the mundane. And as I try to present the images and stories that I think can motivate young men to just be responsible and adult men. I often think of the stories like It's a Wonderful Life, or I shared one of my favorite little exchanges in a movie is Lars and the Real Girl, which is not a movie most people think of when they think about what's a good image of masculinity. It's about Ryan Gosling. Well, Gosling's become kind of a machismo guy. He's literally me, Mr. Gosling. But one of my favorite films is him, Lars and the Real Girl, where he's this troubled young man. He's really confused, and largely because his elder brothers abandoned him and he had an abusive dad. And there's this beautiful scene in the movie. And so he becomes a recluse but then the pivot in the movie is him realizing I need to grow up because my brother's about to have a kid and I don't want to repeat the failures that I had received. And therefore he develops this relationship with his blow up doll. Okay, that's another conversation. But there's this beautiful scene in the movie where he asks his brother, how did you know when you were a man? Which is just like, it'd be good if more guys just asked that question, by the way. It's a great question. And his brother stumbles, doesn't know what to answer. And he answers with this line. He's like, look, he's like, basically when I realized I had to be responsible for other people, even when it costs something. And I was like, dang, like, I know that might sound too stereotyped. It might sound too scripted, but man, that's pretty good. And I think that really helped him start thinking differently. And that's what I think. But it's the glory of the mundane of just like caring for other people that God's put in your path. Stop obsessing about how you perform masculinity. Try to be someone who takes care of others.
Yeah, if I were to just say one more thing myself to add to that, I don't feel like, I'm sitting around talking to young men a lot these days, and sometimes I don't feel like I have a whole lot to say, in the concrete. But I think one thing I do keep coming back to, and I'll just reiterate it here for whoever's listening, I do think one thing that's huge in this generation is getting out of your mind and into the world. I struggle with that, but getting out of your head and into the world. And because the world really is a good thing. I don't think we know how deep our jadedness, our cynicism, our lack of motivation, our depression, there are things, there's a flatness in our relationship to the goodness of this grand world God has made. And it's a flatness that exists in me. I teach philosophy, and so I guess I can't not end, thinking of it more metaphysically, right? But being is good. It is good to be, and to be a man is to the mode in which you be. Again, sorry to wax philosophical. For me, I think if I were to inflect that, it is discovering my life as a life in which I'm an agent. I'm only here for a time, And to have a sense that God has given away a share of freedom to you to move through this world with the gifts he's given you is to have the awesome responsibility of adult responsibility. And I think, and it's good. It's good to have that gift. And there's a good world to move into with it. It's a hard world and it's a war and there's a battle to be fought, but it's a good thing. And there's a good God to rest in.
I think there's a connection between masculinity at its best and seriousness, weightiness. There's a sense in which the greatest threat to masculinity in our day is a sort of juvenilization, where, first of all, there's a lack of a generational transition, the sort of thing that James was describing, where a person has to take responsibility because they are now in a situation where another life is dependent upon them. Or they're thrown into a situation and they find that they have a mission, and that mission is important, and they can't go around like boys anymore. They have to be serious. They have to act like grown-ups. There's a sense in which the father figure and growing up, making a generational transition, all these sorts of things, and rites of passage are hugely important for men, and in ways that they're not for women in the same way, because nature itself tends to give women more of a rite of passage in the bearing of children, and men, it seems to me, require something more of a social framework within which to make those transitions. And we live in a society that's trivializing where we, and here is one of my concerns about the benefit, for all the benefits of sport, and there are real benefits, there is a danger that masculinity is something that we primarily experience and pursue in the context of entertainment and consumption. And that is whether we're playing a game or whether we're watching a game and drinking some beers with the guys, masculinity tends increasingly to be associated with more juvenile practices. And those things have their place, but if we're going to be engaging in mature masculinity, we need to have a serious, weighty mission. And again, it's difficult within part of the problem is men have a particular way of going about these things, but the loss of male spaces connected with weighty missions is one of the things that tends to limit masculinity in its expression. And so it tends to go into those margins of entertainment and shared consumption that don't offer as much in terms of helping men to become men, to grow up and to move beyond a sort of boyhood. And the sorts of visions that we have to resist a society that's heavily neutralized tend to be the rebellion of a certain juvenile young man rather than actual grown-up father figures, male figures who represent a serious, weighty mission in the world, all of these sorts of things. And it's one of the reasons I think that people responded to someone like Jordan Peterson, because he spoke to that particular desire for a weighty engagement with the world that takes seriously the difficulty and the challenge and the sorrow and the trauma and the just the tragedy of life, but also just the glory of actually taking weight upon yourself and growing under that weight. And for many men, that was just, it was cold water in the wilderness. This was a vision of what they could be. And it seems to me that if we're looking for masculinity, we need a sense of a weighty mission. And it's one of the things that I think we see in Scripture. Adam was created before the woman, and he was ordered out into the world. And without being ordered out into the world on a weighty mission, it seems to me we will struggle to attain to a real masculinity.
And that is part of what I've been wrestling us towards to some degree. And one of the things that I know we're closing here, and this is a typical Mere Fidelity thing to get to the nub of an issue in the last 5 minutes right before we have to close. But the weight, we keep coming back to that word weightiness, but weight is formative. Pressure is formative. The capacity to bear up under in the particular ways that are inscribed by the Lord in our bodies, in our souls, that are distinctly, women bear up under weight. Women bear up under pressures. Women bear children, all these sorts of things. But this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about is thinking about the ways we tell young men, you were built to bear weight in particular ways, and you're built to respond in particular ways. You were wired by the Lord to, like Adam, till the earth, to build the earth, to do these things for the glory of God. You're supposed to do these things out front for the protection of your people. You're supposed to do these things not solely for yourself, because your glory is being able to bear weight for others to some degree, right? And this is why, you talk about sport. Sport is good when you're a young man. It's formative in those ways as a practice arena for the world. Not being stuck in the same thing, until your 40s or 50s or whatever. But that element, the one thing, if we return to this conversation, that I'd love for us to do is maybe in a part 2 is actually try and actually think about the way that these pressures are supposed to call for something that is unique in our bodies and unique in our souls, unique in the ways that we're wired. And I know there's variations and all that. We can get into that. But I think pushing young men out into the world to touch grass, to carry weights, to even lift some weights, fellas, is about telling them to be fully embodied agents who were made for agency by God specifically in concrete ways, that there's something that they need to feel that they're answering and responding to with their whole selves, their whole souls, with their hand, with 2 hands, gripping and not just thinking and grasping mentally. And I think if we can't point them to those things, we can't really say that we've talked to them about what it means to be a man before the Lord, responsible before the Lord, responsive to the Lord. So with that, I hope we have tilled the soil of the concepts, at least, in this conversation. If you've listened to us thus far, thanks for sticking with us. And if you found this beneficial, rate and review us on iTunes, that sort of thing, or just email in. We do read our emails. We don't respond to all of them, but we do read them. So if there's a thread you'd like to hear us talk about more, we'd love to hear that. But for now, this has been Mere Fidelity.